So for now we have already implemented saving current state of the application into local storage. But as we know, if we create new activity and then refresh the page, the newly created activity will be gone since we're not loading the state from local storage yet. So before getting to implementation of loading the data, let's recall how we have implemented saving data to local storage. So in the main module of our application main.js, we have registered listener for visibility change event, and right before the tab with our application becomes inactive or it is completely closed, this if block will be executed, and save state function is going to save the current state of our application into the local storage. As we can see, the state includes array of timeline item objects as well as activity objects, and this data is stringified before saving it into the local storage. So now we're getting to the second part of this functionality, which is loading the data. So in this listener, if the first if block will not be executed, that means that tab with our application has become active again, and we have to load the data from local storage. So let's use new function load state, which we're going to define right below. And all we have to do in here is delegate the functionality to our module storage. So we'll call method load on this object. And now let's open up storage.js and write implementation for the function load. So in here, I'm going to receive the state from the local storage into constant called state. Here we use getItem method to get the state by key. As a key we're using appName, which is stored inside appName constant. And here, since this state will be stringified, we need to check first if it even exists, because there might be cases when state of the application will not be stored inside a local storage. So here we're using ternary expression and checking if state exists. Then we have to parse it before using. So let's call method parse on the JSON object. Otherwise, we're going to return an empty state, which is an empty object like this. And finally, this data that we have just received from local storage, we have to save it in the constant in the main module where we're calling method load. And now, this data we have received, we need to assign this state to corresponding reactive variables, timeline items, which is supposed to store array of timeline item objects, as well as activities, which stores activity objects. And this way, since both of these arrays are reactive, the whole UI of our application will be properly updated, and it will display the latest state of our application, which was restored from local storage. And just to make sure we're gonna get into each of these if blocks, I'm going to write print statements, so we will make sure these blocks will be executed. So after we refresh the page, we see only one log, which corresponds to saving the state after page gets reloaded. But as for loading the state from local storage, that part of code is not executed for some reason after page refreshes. And the reason to that is because loading the data from local storage will only happen when the tab with our application will be active again, but not on the initial upload. So if I'm gonna switch over to another tab and then go back to the tab with our application, in this case we see that another part of if is executed because we're seeing the log visible. So that means data is loaded from local storage. So since the data is loaded only when the tab with our application becomes active, in addition to that, we should also make sure that we are gonna load the state of the application on the initial page load. So right here, outside of the listener, we have to call that function again, load state. So the state of the application will be loaded on the initial page load, right before our Vue application will be initialized. Let's just make sure that this is really the case. Let's put arbitrary console log statement inside of load state function, switch over to the browser, refresh the page, and as we can see, that log load state has appeared. So that means now if we're going to modify our app state in any way, for example, by adding new activity, and then if we'll refresh the page, we're supposed to see our newly created activity. So it was persisted and successfully fetched from local storage. And the same will be true for timeline item objects. If we're going to modify any timeline item object and then refresh the page, we can see that the timeline item object state was also restored. So now let's just go back and remove all those temporary console log statements from all these functions. And at the end, I prefer to refactor this part of code. We can leverage ternary expression in here to make this code a little bit more concise. So if tab with our application will become active, which means visibility state property will be equal to visible. In this case, we're gonna call load state function to load the state from local storage. Otherwise, we should save the state to local storage before our app gets destroyed, meaning that our app is closed or tab with our application becomes inactive. So that looks good. Let's continue development in the next lesson.